After releasing my ultimate 85mm f1.4 lens test video, I had a number of people asking me how the new Sigma lens stacks up against the Sony 85mm f1.8. Well, my friends, ask and you shall receive, because today I'm going to be comparing the Sigma 85mm f1.4 against the Sony 85mm f1.8 and deciding whether it's time I should ditch the Sony glass and buy the brand new Sigma. So currently I actually own the Sony 85mm f1.8 and it seems like so do a lot of you guys. I bought this lens a while back because at the time it was one of the few affordable 85mm options for Sony mirrorless cameras that offered good image quality and didn't weigh the same as a very small planet. Now before you all start screaming in the comments section saying, what about the Samyang 85mm 1.4? Or what about the Viltrox 85mm f1.8? Because I know both of these lenses are within the same sort of price bracket as the Sony f1.8. Well, I've already kind of given my verdict on the Samyang in the group test video, which if you haven't already watched, you can watch here. As for the Viltrox, at the time that I was purchasing the Sony, the Viltrox 85mm kind of wasn't on the market, or at least wasn't known about, so I've still not had a chance to test this lens. Though maybe this is a lens that we can test in another video. If you would like to see that, let me know in the comments below. Anyway, back to our lens test. Let's start by comparing the two lenses in terms of features, and let's start with the Sony. The Sony 85mm f1.8 is predominantly plastic in build and as a result is very, very lightweight, coming in at just 371 grams. On the lens body itself, there's an AF to MF switch and there's also a customizable button. The Sigma 85mm f1.4 is predominantly made of metal, which means that it's a shade heavier than the Sony, weighing in at 625 grams. Though despite this, it's definitely not classed as a heavy lens. It's certainly a lot lighter than you'd expect an f1.4 lens to be and doesn't feel at all front heavy when mounted to my Sony A7 III. On the side of the lens, there's a manual aperture ring that can be declicked using a switch, which may be handy for videographers who like to adjust the exposure using the aperture but don't want to click awkwardly through all of the stops. There's also a lock switch on the side that'll keep the aperture ring set to automatic mode should you want to use the dials on the back of your camera to adjust the aperture like a regular lens. Just like the Sony, there's a manual AF to MF switch and there's also a customizable button. So let's move on and talk about image quality. For our first test, we wanted to see if any of the lenses had signs of vignetting or lens distortion. And to test this, we simply took a photo of a brick wall, which obviously has plenty of horizontal and vertical lines, so it should be pretty obvious to see if there's any kind of distortion on these lenses. Before we get started, I do need to mention that Sigma have stated that in order to keep the weight and size of their lens down, they had to compromise when it came to fixing things like lens distortion and vignetting in lens. Now what this means is, to counter this, they've said that they've taken advantage of Sony's in-camera lens compensation settings instead, which should remove some of these issues. If you don't know how to enable the lens compensation settings on your camera, then here's how to do it on my Sony A7 III. It should be a very similar process for most other Sony mirrorless cameras. In the settings menu, go to the first tab of options and then navigate to the second page and locate the option that says Lens Comp. Within these options, make sure all of the settings are set to auto. So to make this a fair test, we took our test images with both the lens compensation settings activated and also another set of images with them deactivated to see what would happen. So the Sony's up first, and even with the lens compensation setting turned off, there doesn't seem to be any noticeable signs of distortion at the edges of the frame when shooting wide open at f1.8. There is a bit of vignetting at the corners, but nothing terrible, and once the lens correction settings were enabled, this problem was all but removed. So all in all, a pretty good performance from the Sony. The Sigma, on the other hand, is a slightly different story. Just as Sigma suggested, without the lens correction settings enabled, there is a lot of pincushion distortion in our image, as well as some fairly heavy vignetting around the corners. However, once the lens compensation settings have been activated, these issues are pretty much entirely removed. Now, before we move on, it is worth mentioning that the in-camera lens corrections will not apply to RAW images. They only apply to JPEGs and video files. However, once this lens has been released, it's very likely that Adobe and other software packages will add this new lens profile to their lens correction adjustments, which will basically mean that you'll be able to correct for all of these issues with just a click of a button when editing. But obviously, until that happens, you will need to correct for these issues manually in post when shooting in RAW, which is just something to bear in mind. Now, next we wanted to test for any signs of chromatic aberration, which is also known as fringing, which is kind of that purple or green edging you sometimes find in your images around high contrast areas. Whilst we were at it, we also tested to see what kind of bokeh balls these lenses would create as well. As you can see, when shooting wide open on the Sony at 1.8, the bokeh balls have a distinct cat's eye shape throughout the frame, rather than a perfectly round orb of light. In terms of fringing, there is some evidence of purple fringing here, and also some quite heavy green fringing over here as well. The bokeh balls in the Sigma test images were a lot rounder in the center of the frame when shooting wide open at f1.4, but these turned more cat's eye shape around the edges. There were no signs of purple fringing at all throughout the image, which is really good, and there's only a very, very small hint of green fringing over here. So overall, in this round of testing, the Sigma kind of takes it. In the next set of tests, I wanted to look at AF speed and accuracy when shooting wide open. Both lenses performed incredibly well, locking onto the targets with no signs of hunting, even in low light conditions. When snapping a moving target walking towards the camera, both lenses would occasionally drop focus, but overall, both lenses were pretty much on par in terms of performance here. To be fair to the lenses, this is a really tricky test. It's very, very unlikely that you're going to be shooting a moving subject at f1.4 or f1.8. We just wanted to test both lenses to the extreme to see how they would cope. Before we move away from these test images, I just want to show you here on Paul's top, you can see some more examples of that purple fringing with the Sony lens I was talking about earlier. In contrast, the Sigma doesn't show any purple fringing in the same area. We also tested this again with a stationary subject, and the images taken with the Sigma appear to be much more consistently sharp overall, despite the fact that the Sigma images were shot at a wider aperture of f1.4. In terms of subject separation, obviously shooting with an f1.8 or an f1.4 lens, you're going to get that really nice shallow depth of field, which is going to make your subject pop from the background. In terms of bokeh, both of these lenses when shooting wide open give you a nice creamy uniform defocused area, and I wouldn't be disappointed with either performance. Switching over to video mode, both lenses managed to track a moving subject even when walking at a fast pace towards the camera, so both are winners in this round. On the whole, both lenses focus really quietly too, though the Sigma is definitely the noisier of the two. It's still pretty quiet. It sounds a bit like a fax machine though when it focuses, which is weird. Whilst the Sony is whisper quiet and barely makes any sound at all. I don't even know if you can hear that. It's making absolutely no noise. Okay, with the practical tests out of the way, let's talk about pricing. At launch, the Sigma is priced at £999 or $1,199, whilst the Sony you can pick on Amazon for around £479 or $598. This means that the Sony is pretty much half the price of the Sigma, but that's kind of to be expected considering that the Sigma is an f1.4 lens, and we all know that you pay through the nose for a faster lens. But I guess the question I've got to ask myself is the Sigma really worth that extra money? Well, one thing is for sure, I can definitely tell you it's not worth paying the extra money just to get the Sigma because it's got a marginally wider aperture of 1.4. When shooting at f1.4, the images you create are going to be almost indistinguishable from the images you shoot at f1.8. To prove this theory, here are two images that I've taken using the same lens. One has been shot at f1.4, the other has been shot at f1.8. Now, which one do you think is the 1.4 image? If you think you know, let me know in the comments below. 10 points to Gryffindor if you manage to get that one right. It's also worth mentioning that the amount of additional light that's able to pass through the lens onto your sensor using a 1.4 lens instead of a 1.8 will generally equate to less than a stop, so it's unlikely that it's going to make a massive difference when it comes to shooting in low light either. So based off image quality and general performance, is the Sigma worth the additional £500? Well, I think the answer is ultimately yes and no. Let me explain. So let's start by talking about what you actually gain for your extra £500 by choosing the Sigma over the Sony. For starters, you get slightly better build quality, albeit at a heavier weight. You get that manual aperture dial if that's something that floats your boat. But ultimately, I think the most important thing is the increased image quality. All of the images shot with the Sigma were much sharper, even wide open at 1.4, which was super impressive. The bokeh balls in the center of the frame were much more round compared to the Sony, and also chromatic aberration just wasn't a problem with the Sigma, whereas the Sony, you were getting quite harsh purple and green fringing. So for me personally, is this enough to make me ditch the Sony and buy the Sigma? Yeah, probably. So for me, I'm really lucky to be a full-time photographer who makes a living using a camera. So my lenses are my tools and I need them to work flawlessly or as near to it as possible in order to give myself the best possible chance of providing high quality images for my clients. However, if I was a hobbyist photographer who doesn't make any money at all from taking photos, you just do it for the love of it, and I still wanted a nice 85mm lens to take portraits with and shoot other things, I would totally save my money and go for the Sony. It's a great lens overall and it's very well priced, offers good image quality and good AF performance. So in short, if you're a pro and you want a high performing 85mm lens, then definitely get the Sigma. If you're a hobbyist or you're just on a very tight budget, then save your money and get the Sony. Anyway, that's about it for this week. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have any feedback for us or you think there's something we can improve with these tests, then do let us know. We're always open to feedback. Let us know in the comments below. If you like this video, then please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. We create content like this every single Friday. So we'll see you in the next one.